sustainable travel policy. And one of the issues that came up there, of course, is to do with aviation emissions and the question of whether we should offset them. We don't at the moment, unless we're required to do so, as at least one of our funders, the Wellcome Trust, requires us to do. But as an institution, we don't have a policy. So we have decided that we need to develop a policy for the whole college, for the whole university. And as part of that, we've created a working group, which has now met twice. And we are also holding at least 2 of these discussions to try and involve and engage the wider King's community to find out more about what we ought to be doing, to learn from what people know, and to make sure that we have in the end, a position that is defensible and understood and felt to be legitimate. So that's why we're having this debate. It will be in the form of a panel discussion, which I will try to facilitate, and you will have a chance to participate in polls at various stages as well. I think there are 2 polls, aren't there, Yone? And Yone will jump in and make those happen at the right time. We've got 4 really interesting people today who I'll ask to introduce themselves. The broad framework of the session will be that we'll have a round of introductions, then we'll do a first round of polling, and please do participate. It's quite a simple thing. You just need to answer some questions on the screen, and we'll get a result. Then there'll be a panel discussion of about 50 minutes, and then a chance for people who are listening to ask questions and receive further answers, and then a second poll and some synthesis, hopefully, and wrap up right at the end. So we'll be through by 3:30. I hope that's okay. And let me just. Do you want to do the poll now, or shall I just do the quick introduction on the slides? Okay, why don't we go to slide 2, Yona? Actually, why don't we just set the terms? So, what is carbon offsetting? Broadly, what it means is that as a university, we emit all sorts of emissions associated with heating our buildings and lighting it and so on. And those at the moment are, it's quite a large set of emissions we have in scope 1, 2, and 3. We emit about 180,000 tons a year. It's a large number. It's a small town, in fact. But then again, we are a community of, nearly 50,000 people, and we operate 5 large sites in central London. Broadly, what you seek to do with carbon offsetting is you either avoid or you seek to dispose of carbon somewhere else in order to compensate for those emissions which you're doing. So you're offsetting. One of the aspects that we've learnt about in these first discussions about a carbon offsetting policy for Kings is that intrinsic to doing that is that we're likely to have to develop an internal carbon price. And the reason for that is to establish what value we attribute to carbon emissions and their reduction. So if, for instance, we're investing in a new building or the refurbishment of a building, what price are we willing to pay for the incremental kilogram of carbon that we're going to avoid, say, by putting more insulation or triple glazing or whatever? And that internal carbon price indicates for us how we do that resource allocation. And we can do that through shadow prices. We might also have internal levies. So for instance, if we go on a flight somewhere, a business related flight, we might impose a tax a levy on that flight of some amount. Other institutions levy amounts up to, say, £30 per flight, and that money would then be recycled perhaps into carbon reduction activities we do elsewhere in the college. So those are some of the things, some of the tools that exist in some of the basic terms. Jona, next slide. And then just broadly, how are emissions described? We have scope 1 and 2 emissions are those that are directly controllable. Either they're things that we do immediately through our own combustion, or through gas and other things that we consume directly, for instance through our boilers. And then scope 3 is everything else. It's in our supply chain when we buy products. I don't know, new photocopiers, there's an embedded a carbon emission associated with that. Obviously water supply and treatment, our flights, all those things are scope 3. So many of these things are probably familiar to you, but just as a reminder, really. Okay, if everyone's happy, if the panel is happy, then we'll get going with the panel. So perhaps I could go first of all to Rachel. Rachel, perhaps you could introduce yourself and just tell us what your connection is with this issue of offsetting.
Thanks, Fran. So I'm Rachel Rothman. I'm a professor of sustainable chemical engineering at the University of Sheffield. I have several hats related to sustainability. So I co-direct our Grantham Centre for Sustainable Futures, and I direct the South Yorkshire Sustainability Centre. But probably most pertinent to the offsetting question is that I'm our academic lead for sustainability at Sheffield. And that means that I've been heavily involved in developing our sustainability strategy and leading the kind of conversations that you're having at King's, thinking about offsetting and other aspects. So I also sit on the advisory board for the Carbon Coalition, and that's a group of higher education institutions looking at how we can have collective buying power. So if we do choose to offset, if we're able to do that together, you can get better value for money potentially on offsets. But not only that, it's about verifying the offsets, looking at the scoring criteria that would be needed for something to count as an offset, so that we make sure that any offsetting we do is robust rather than not.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Rachel, and thanks so much for making the time to join our debate. We look forward to all your knowledge and opinions. Oliver Perkins. Oliver.
Hi everyone. Yeah, I'm Oliver or Ol. So I'm a modeler working on climate-related issues, and I do specifically something called human Earth system modeling, which is basically jargon for in our global scale climate models of the climate system, trying to represent human responses to a changing climate. So, it gets hotter, our crops experience more water stress. How do we respond to that, and what sort of spillover consequences could that have? And there are sort of two really big things and reasons why we want to do that. The first of which I've sort of described there is to look at these adaptation issues and these limits or potential maladaptation, trying to adapt and making things worse. And the other really big thing that we look at when we try and look at these interactions between human systems and the changing climate is what we call land-based carbon dioxide removal. So basically methods of sucking CO2 out the atmosphere using trees, plants, and soil. And in particular, the work we do is really looking at stress testing some of the current assessments and projections of what's possible and feasible through land-based CDR, which tend to be based on sort of technical and economic aspects. And we're trying to bring in a broader range of criteria, so to look at things like fire risk, tree mortality on a warmer planet, and so forth. And so my academic work on this tends to be global, working with the UK Met Office's Earth System model, and I've also done 6 months at DEFRA where we looked at this in a particular UK context. So that's me.
Oliver, thank you very much indeed. Carly Gash.
Thank you, Fran. So I'm Carly Gash Kuralbaeva. I'm senior lecturer in economics at the Department of Political Economy at King's College. So I work much broader issues related to climate change and environmental economics. So in relation to offsetting, I have done some research. Obviously, I bring to the discussion economics perspective on this issue. And I also teach environmental economics, where one of the topics is voluntary carbon markets, and offsetting is one of the key concepts within the broader voluntary carbon markets.
Fantastic. Thank you, Carly. Really good. And finally, our final panel member is Joachim after Heide.
Yes, hello. I am a reader in the philosophy department. I do mostly history of philosophy, in particular ethics. And at some point, 5-6 years ago, a colleague and we've perceived a lack that we are not teaching our students about moral issues related to the environment. So then we designed a class on environmental ethics, which is now an opportunity module for every student of the university, so they could all go there. And for me especially, so that's on the one hand is what I think I have to or want to give back, given that society has sort of helped me become a thinker. I think I need to put this back to the students and to society at large. On the other hand, it is also intellectually very interesting because to see that in the history of philosophy that our relationship to the environment wasn't hugely theorized, and now it is one of the most important topics, I think. So from that perspective, we do very much enjoy teaching it. And offsetting in particular, that is one issue that about half the class is related to climate change, and then offsetting is one specific lecture, of course, on that, but it comes up in pretty much every week of those topics. That's it.
Fantastic. So we've got a really broad panel. We've got a chemical engineer. We've got a climate modeler. We've got an economist, and we've got a philosopher and ethicist. So, I mean, I think, we tried to collect together a really broad range of expertise for this debate, and I'm looking forward to the discussion hugely. So there are 5 questions which I'd like to go through with the panel, and what the panel is going to do is just respond as they like, and I'll try and just facilitate a discussion, and then at about 3 o'clock we'll move towards a Q&A session. So panel, the first question really is to do with the moral dilemmas about offsetting. There are many views about this. Some people think it's morally appropriate. It's just a technical solution, and why would you worry about it? There are clearly questions about motivation. If you buy off a guilt, then what happens to your motivation to change your behavior? There are obviously moral dimensions to do with the effect on the communities where you're doing the projects, where the offsetting is happening, and so on. There's a whole variety of different. There are issues to do with temporality and so on. So, oh right, Rosie is reminding me we were going to do the first poll. Is that right, Yona? Before we go into the first question. Sorry, I haven't been paying attention. Do we do the first poll, Yona?
Yes, so the idea with the poll, just sorry to quickly interrupt, but this is for the audience to participate in a set of polls. They will come back at the end, but we would like to have a bit of a comparison between the start, before we have hopefully an interesting discussion, and then at the end, after having some more insights and different perspectives. So I'll just launch that now. It should take a couple of minutes, and then we can go into that discussion.
Okay.
So they're just 4 questions. You can click through those. So if you can complete it by maybe 20 past, then we can go into the discussion then.
Has everyone done that? Has everyone looked at the responses and the answers and where you stand? That's actually very interesting. Yona, you're sort of you have an overview of participation. Is everyone happy, do you think?
Yeah, they're still trickling in, so maybe we can wait a few more seconds.
Okay.
Right, so we've got 50 responses now, so I think we can move on to discussion, and I believe everyone should be able to view the results. So it's interesting to see at the moment, and what we can compare at the end as well, but that most people do seem to be supportive of introducing a carbon offsetting scheme.
Great, good. So we'll come back to that at the end, and we'll see whether views have changed as well. That's the purpose of doing 2 polls. Right, so this is a moral dilemma. So I'm bound to ask, first of all, our philosopher, Joachim, could you take us through what you see as the sort of great moral issues that we need to be addressing as we think about whether we apply and how we apply this in the university?
Yes, of course. So I think one good way of addressing the question of offsetting and whether we should or shouldn't do it is through considering the question of justice. Right. So just go back. Right. The basic thought is that, well, we are emitting quite a lot and thereby contribute to climate change. The whole Earth is going to be affected by that, and in particular, it'll be those countries that haven't actually polluted as much. And that seems to be unjust, that we are benefiting from emitting a lot of greenhouse gases at the cost of the quality of life of a lot of other people, right? So it seems like, well, we should be doing something. And one idea in which one can conceive of offsetting is this, that offsetting prevents harm. Right? So if we emit a certain amount of greenhouse gases, and we cause the exact same amount to be reduced through projects somewhere else, then it looks like we haven't actually changed the climate, and in that sense, or we haven't contributed to possible climate change. And in that sense, it seems like we didn't do any harm. So then the idea is that, well, morally speaking, it would be equivalent to say that we are emitting and offsetting, because the amount remains exactly the same. That would be morally equivalent to not emitting in the first place. So that is one of the ideas behind it. So no harm done, we are not unjust, right? So that would be one idea for saying that we definitely do need to offset in order to avoid being unjust. Now, briefly, I think there are 2 problems with this basic argument. So on the one hand is the idea that if you emit and offset, the net amount of the greenhouse gases is exactly the same. This is something that Rachel has already alluded to. For most of the schemes, you cannot exactly calculate how much you are really reducing. And it's really important to there keep in mind what would have happened otherwise, right? When you're investing in improving infrastructure, would they have done it anyway? When would they have done it? So it's really, really difficult to calculate that. And therefore, then to say that, well, look, it's exactly the same is on pretty shaky grounds. So that, I would think, is the empirical premise of that. And then there is another, perhaps a little bit more conceptual premise to it, where you say that the only thing that matters is the net amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And here I think one can perhaps think about it in this way, that yes, sure, climate is a really difficult and global phenomenon, but it makes a difference whether we are emitting, let's say here, and reducing or have projects on the other side of the earth to to sequester carbon dioxide, let's say. So I think there can be changes in weather patterns or something like that that are caused by this. And again, therefore, what you would be doing is you are harming on the one hand, and you are preventing harm somewhere else. But the general effect is not the same. So you're still harming people, but you would be at the same time doing something good. That's why I think, yeah, so that is, I think, a moral problem. If you harm somebody, are you then required to do something good? And yes, it seems like that's a good idea, but could we possibly, given that it's a global phenomenon, we can't really target the people that we happen to harm by having, let's say, carbon sequestration projects somewhere else. So that, again, is a really, really big difficulty in keeping justice. Okay, sorry for speaking so long, but that's maybe what I wanted to say.
Extremely helpful to have it explained in that way. And you touched on the question of additionality as well, which I'm sure we'll come back to as well. Who'd like to follow that first elaboration of some moral issues? Oliver, I saw you nodding a lot. Do you want to respond to some of the points that Joachim made?
Yeah, what do I think? I think the ethics of it are, well, you have to stay in your lane, don't you? And I think that some of these ethical questions sit very rightly in the realm of moral philosophy, and I have no expertise there beyond a sort of average citizen. But I think that some of these questions can be elucidated by thinking about how carbon dioxide removal, as we term it in the literature, is envisaged in contributing to achieving the goals of the Paris Agreement in sort of decarbonisation scenarios. So the world currently emits about 50 gigatons, 50 billion tons of CO2 or CO2 equivalents per year, and the sort of central projection of these of a sort of like Paris compliant decarbonisation scenario. In 2050, we remove about 8 gigatons of CO2 from the atmosphere a year. So we're talking on the order of about 20% of global emissions. And like, this is extremely controversial, not least because of these ethical issues, but there are very serious concerns about whether this can actually be delivered to begin with. And secondly, a lot of these removals and a lot of this removal potential is not envisaged as offsetting. It's envisaged as reducing the atmospheric concentration of CO2 to actually mitigate against the harms of climate change, and yeah, to offset the impacts of climate. And so I think this is really important to bear in mind in this context. And so, like, what does this mean in a UK context? Well, I think it means we need to be really cautious about what sectors of the economy and about what economic activities we offset versus structurally decarbonize. And I was listening to an interview the other day by the head of the Committee on Climate Change, who's basically like, for the UK, given these very serious concerns over the feasibility of large-scale removals and the necessity of actually producing negative emissions and not using them all as offsets, that really in the UK we should only be looking at flying and farming to offset, and these other issues we should be looking to structurally decarbonize. And so within the context of like Paris Agreement pathways, that would be how I would balance the ethical questions.
Really interesting. So there's a question about proportionality or appropriateness as well, that, you know, there might be some activities where there's sort of irreducible emissions that where offsetting is acceptable, but others where really the focus has to be on reduction at source. Yes, okay, very interesting and important point. Rachel, do you want to jump in at this stage?
Yeah, I think there's two separate angles to the sort of moral and ethical dilemmas. One is, from our perspective, should we be offsetting? What should we be offsetting? How should we be offsetting? But imagine we are going to do some. There's then quite strong moral and ethical implications of some of the pathways that people might choose to use for offsetting, because quite often offsetting projects you will find are in the global south, for example, which have implications on the people who live there. And so I think there's a whole other angle of moral and ethical obligations, considerations that have to be thought about there, as well as what's our obligation to do from a moral standpoint here. And of course, it's not just the morality, because net zero is called net zero for a reason, because we're not going to get to absolute zero. It's not possible to get to absolute zero. And really, we need to look at how low can we go. And I don't think we should be offsetting until the point we've got us as low as we can go. And that ties in with the economic angles. And at the University of Sheffield, we don't have a full offsetting policy, but we have some guiding principles for now. And the idea is we come back to look at it again in a few years' time when we get closer to some of our targets. But our principle at the minute is we shouldn't offset anything other than business travel. And that's because any money we might choose to spend, we should be spending to reduce our emissions, which has a long lasting effect forever. You know, you spend the money, you reduce your emissions, rather than to spend your money on offsetting where you've spent it and then you have to spend it again the next year and the next year and the next year, because you're still trying to offset that emission. And I think that is a balance. Well, that's also part of the moral considerations, because we only have so much money to spend and all of these things cost money. And so I don't think you can look at the kind of moral and economic in isolation. And I think the other moral consideration is around double counting. Double counting happens quite a lot, not intentionally always, sometimes intentionally. But imagine you chose to offset some of your scope 3 emissions, which might be your supply chain emissions, because you know there's a footprint. But what happens if your supplier also chooses to offset their emissions, but you don't know about that? Or within the offset world, you'll see there's double counting where there's all sorts of horror stories with offsets being sold to 50 different people for the same bunch of trees, for example. So I think there's some moral things there about making sure that if we choose to offset, we really understand what those offsets are doing. It can't be a kind of free pass that, oh, I've offset it so I can keep doing what I was doing and someone else is dealing with that offsetting. We actually need to understand how it works, what it is we're doing, and make sure that it's a credible way of doing it.
Whole series of really important points, but I thought that last one is particularly important. It's to do with the quality of the projects in which you choose to offset. So there's a moral question there as well about, you know, how tough are you about the evidence you require that actually things are being done responsibly and correctly, and that the numbers that you're being offered, a ton of carbon sequestered somewhere, is actually true, and you know that a carbon credit once it comes to the end of its life, the tree is chopped down or something is then retired. So all of that needs to work. The economy needs to work and be verifiable. Otherwise, you shouldn't be doing it. Carly, economists are constantly thinking about issues of morality as well. Of course, political economy is all about these questions and how they're dealt with in society. What thoughts do you have on this question about the moral dilemmas here?
Yeah, so probably I will expand as a part of the discussion on the effect on local communities, right? So obviously, again, you can look at the financial and economic issues here, because the big question is whether local communities are going to reap benefits from those projects. And another important related question is financial transparency, because clearly between let's say Microsoft and local farmers in Brazil, there are a lot of different agents in between. So therefore, how we can make sure that those who actually implementing those projects on the ground are going really benefit from those projects, and what are the additional or let's say co-benefits of offset projects? How does it affect local communities? Are there any sort of spillover effects on other forms of economic activity at the local level? So essentially, this will bring the host of sort of development issues as well, right? And in addition, well, as a political economist, you need to look at sort of institutional structure as well. When you talk about whether local communities are going to reap benefits, ultimate question is who holds the property rights over those lands where, let's say, this deforestation or projects, forestry projects will be implemented, and then what is the institutional structure in a given country? What is the relationship between local government with local farmers, also that government with international donors or corporations and so on?
Very interesting. So, yeah, as we offset, and particularly if we're involved in projects in other parts of the world that we may not know a lot about and with which we may have limited contact, but we're affecting those places economically and so on in terms of property rights, institutions, and so on. So there are all sorts of moral questions which emerge from that sort of interaction, from the intervention that happens as a result. Really interesting broad set of considerations there. So let's hold all of that. I mean, I think that's opened up the question and shown us how really complex this is and very difficult. And I think, just to come back to something Rachel said about what you've done at Sheffield, you don't have a policy, you have a series of guidelines, and broadly what you've said is you'll do as little offsetting as you can manage. In the short term, you're only going to apply it to business travel. So that's one approach which we here at King's might think about as well. So thank you very much for that. So then we move on to the second question, which is to do with, I mean, given these complexities and also some of the difficulties that people have spoken to about additionality, transparency, the accountability, whether we trust the schemes that are being invested in, how can offsets or offsetting be reformed? You know, given Oliver's point at the beginning that, you know, if you need 8 gigatons of carbon disposal by the 2050s, which is what the modelers tell us, you know, we are going to be extracting huge amounts of carbon, some of it, you know, in temporary ways, in land-based, and hopefully also much more permanent disposals in, you know, old gas reservoirs or whatever. You know, building the the supply chains, the technologies, the industrial system to enable that. The voluntary carbon market may be part of that as well. So what can be done to reform or develop some guidelines that will allow us to make the right kinds of choices in relation to offsetting? What should we be paying attention to? Maybe I'll ask Rachel to start, because you've sort of been through this already, and I know that through the Carbon Coalition that you're part of, that you've been thinking about this already. So, you know, what kind of terms should we be thinking about here?
Sorry, struggling to get the unmute button. There we go. Yeah, it's a good question. And I think, well, when the work we did with the Carbon Coalition, we looked at a lot of different factors that were important to consider when deciding if an offset could be part of the project. And I think this comes back a bit to what Oliver was saying before about, would this thing have happened anyway, or is this really an offset? So just because it's something that might remove CO2 from the air, I mean, the trees in my back garden remove CO2 from the air, but I'm not going to count them as an offset because they're already there and they already exist. And so what can we kind of morally count as an offset? And I think when we're thinking about reforming and, you know, what are mitigation projects and what can be nature-based solutions, it can be a really fine line about whether that's truly something that can be counted as an offset, or whether it's something that's just there that's removing CO2. And I think it's quite nuanced and quite hard to decide. And we've had a lot of conversations about this within the Carbon Coalition, looking at how you measure lots of different factors that might be relevant, and how you can then effectively make a scorecard for offsets. And I think one key message is we don't all need to be, and we shouldn't all try to be, experts in offsetting. There are people who are working on guidelines and standards, and there are companies who are looking at making standards, and there's things like the Carbon Coalition who are looking at making standards. And there's not a uniform regulation, for example, across the UK about it, but there are people with expertise looking at it. And I think what's important as universities is we are aware of the people who have that expertise, and we tap into it, not that we try and rewrite the rule book ourselves from scratch, because there's not a need to do that. And yeah, I do think when we're looking at different projects we might use, that's important, and tapping into all of the things that are going on that are already looking at how it might reform and how you might use it going forward is really important. And just one extra thing on the one thing we really found in Sheffield when we introduced our yes, you can offset your business travel, and that was partly, as you said right at the start, Franz, because Wellcome Trust now allow their grant holders to offset their business travel, and most funding bodies don't allow that at the moment, and some probably never will, and others may also join in the same way as Wellcome Trust has. And what we found at Sheffield was we didn't have an internal accounting system that enabled that. So, you know, if you're an academic and you're writing a grant, you might have consumables or equipment or whatever, but there wasn't a line in our financial systems that was put this money here if you want to be able to do offsetting with it. And what we did a few years ago in Sheffield was we bought £10,000 of carbon offsets through the Carbon Coalition pilot. So this was a pilot where lots worked together. That's quite a small amount. That's not going to buy you masses of carbon offsets. But we did it, and it was, what was really useful was that it forced us to set up our systems so that we had the potential to do that going forward. So even if you weren't offsetting much, now when I'm doing the costing for a grant, if I wanted to and the funder enabled me, there is a line for me to put that offsetting in. And the other thing it did is it meant anyone within the university who wants to offset buys it from our accredited, verified pot of offsets. And we're not all just ticking that box because we're flying to a conference and we've flown with a particular airline who has a box that says, tick here to pay me a bit more money and offset my thing. And it's like, well, what offset is that and how's that working? And so having that system in place, it actually took, you know, universities are quite bureaucratic in nature. It took quite a while to get that system set up so that we could account for carbon offsetting in that way. And what it's led on to us is us setting up, we now have a carbon data manager whose role is to look at our carbon footprint across scope 3 and other things. But they now manage that kind of carbon offsetting side of things as well. But they sit within our finance team, because if we're going to offset in a credible way, we have to account carbon in the same way that we account pounds and pence.
Very, very good. We're just recruiting one of these people at King's as well, so very familiar story. Good. I mean, Welcome requires us to offset through the EAUC system, so that's what we do at King's. Yeah. Okay. So reform. Any ideas about reform? Oliver, do you want to join?
Yeah. So I think actually, I'm somewhat optimistic that carbon markets are being reformed, can be reformed, and sort of must be reformed. So I was at a conference last week, and actually 2 of the world's best bioscientists have recently joined a startup called B0, which is basically like Moody's. It's like a risk assessor for carbon offsets. And so now every time someone puts a carbon offset on the market, they give it a rating and of like how reliable the offset is, and how sort of like how much rebound effect it's likely to have, and all this kind of detailed stuff. And I think the work is really impressive, and they're also able to show that assets that they give a higher rating in terms of the credits that are being sold relate to higher value offsets are now bought for more money. So I think what we're starting to see is that companies don't actually want to buy low value garbage offsets. And so I think there has been a kind of market led response as this kind of this system matures, and we need it to, because this needs to play a role, as controversial as it is, in global decarbonisation. 2 really quick caveats to that. The first is to say that I think it's really problematic when we think about offsetting just in the context of climate targets. It's really important to look at this in the context of the IPBES, or the International Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Service targets around biodiversity, and the Sustainable Development Goals when we're thinking about food security and land degradation. And so there's a slight issue there about how we align a market that's driven around the carbon offsetting needs of Western emitters in the global south, and how we make sure that we line up our biodiversity and sustainable development goals with that. And the other thing is long term. This market-led response is good, cautiously good. It seems to be maturing, but it might lead to allocation of offsets in ways that is not efficient when we're thinking about how to structurally decarbonize. So there's this emerging idea of luxury emissions. In other words, offsetting things we ought to be decarbonizing, that ends up meaning we don't have the offset capacity in 2060 for things that are impossible to decarbonize. So that's kind of cautiously optimistic is where I'm at on that.
Okay, so you're also suggesting a bit like Rachel, perhaps, that there are certain kinds of activities where it should be illegitimate to offset these luxury emissions that you're talking about, Oliver. Is that right? So there are certain classes of activity that we feel where offsetting might be appropriate, and certain classes of activity where it really shouldn't. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, fundamentally, and we need to make sure, again, that I think a good way of dealing with these justice issues is to tie it up with achieving our biodiversity targets and our sustainable development targets, and we can't think about the carbon question in isolation.
Okay, very good. I'll come to Carly next. Carly, I wonder whether there are sort of economic aspects to this. I mean, obviously price is a sort of fundamental signal, isn't it? Here we have a very large range of prices in the market for carbon offsets. I mean, someone mentioned if you fly, the offsets at I actually recently hired a car, and I was allowed to offset it, the hire car, because it wasn't an electric vehicle. And it didn't cost me very much at all. It was an entirely marginal quantity. But a true offset might be actually far more expensive. So, Carly, in terms of reform and where this all needs to go, what are the economic variables here that we need to pay attention to?
Yeah, so well, before I mention and discuss differences in the prices, so maybe let me expand on some of the points discussed earlier. So the first one is clearly one of the biggest issues in relation to offsetting, as has been said, it is underwhelming quality of those offsets. Nevertheless, we already know that there are third-party verifications of those projects, and already there are companies or institutions which are established themselves as sort of providing gold standard of assessment of the quality of those projects. For instance, so-called science-based targets initiative is the biggest and most respected verifier of corporate climate targets, and therefore it sets these gold standards and emission accountability in the corporate sector. So I guess this is even there are complexity issues in relation that we have discussed, additionality, quality of offsets, then potentially leakage issue, etc. I mean, there are already significant steps, in my opinion, have been done in order to make this verification process sort of certified. And as I said already, there are companies which provide that gold standard. So clearly, in terms of that's my opinion. If and also, I guess institutional investors do care about the quality of the offsets, so they are not going to buy any type of the offset projects because it could potentially undermine the credibility. Therefore, demand for those institutions which sort of provide the stamp on quality of the offsets will be just, in my opinion, will be going up. And in terms of different economic activities where we should use offsetting, I think economics arguments are sort of relying with what Rachel and Oliver just discussed. Just to be more specific, I guess what economists think about the offsetting, they do really make sense, because obviously there are some economic activities that cannot be turned in the short to medium term aligned, making them aligned with the goals of the Paris Agreement. So therefore, and since viable technologies are still not available for them to become net zero, let's say, therefore in the short to medium term, we can use these alternative approaches to offset our emissions, and therefore offset projects do play significant role. But in terms of the longer term, I guess economists expect that there will be more important viable technologies who will help with this reduction in the emissions. In terms of the prices, yes, definitely. I mean, if you compare the price of different offset projects, let's say nature-based vis-a-vis some sort of the technology-based, like solar panels, renewable energy, and so on, there is quite a high variation. To some extent, it also reflects the labor costs or the cost of technology, and obviously this is all factored in. But for me, when we were choosing specific offset project, I guess the quality will be most important.
Excellent, good. Joachim, any further comments on reform or the kind of, you know, the kind of scheme that you would want to be involved with if you were going to be offsetting? Yeah.
Yeah, so very much agree with what I was saying about a more holistic approach, that just looking at something that is countable because it suits people who are high emitters, that I think is a big problem. And of course makes it much more difficult than to think about accountability and when have we reached when have we sort of ironed out the harm that we've caused and so on. I think I just want to be, for this purpose of the debate, a bit more radical and say that, well, I don't think, well, perhaps the best improvement for offsetting would be to get rid of the name offsetting. Because it still, I think, implies this idea that, if I take a plane somewhere, it causes that and that much carbon dioxide. If I offset it, I'm okay. So then I'm morally back in the clear. And I think that is very much the wrong impression. So I think it would be much better to focus, to build this as mitigation projects. And that, I think, would very much help to really take this, take the idea of reducing emissions much more seriously. I mean, if you think about it, right, if you have luxury emissions, right, so that's something bad. And then you fund a project where carbon dioxide gets removed, that is something good. To me, it seems just still very hard to think that, okay, if I've done something good, then I'm allowed also to do something bad. So I don't really see how I can get those luxury emissions out of doing something good elsewhere. So that's why I think this concept of offsetting is deeply flawed.
Carly, you want to respond?
Sorry, just a very quick point. I mean, if there is a concern here about sort of overuse and abuse of the offsetting project, then I assume it's possible to bring here regulatory frameworks as well, and sort of the limit amount of offset projects that every firm can use, sort of impose some sort of the constraint depending on some whatever historical emission travel. It should vary across different activities, and I assume this is where it could be regulated as well to address this concern.
I mean, just to jump in there, I think this is really the heart of the issue, is that we don't actually have any really sensible, robust projections of what we can realistically deliver around carbon dioxide removal. We have a lot of very naive, broad brush projections that I think there's very good reason to think are overly optimistic. And as such, we don't have a kind of appropriate marker to define what we call residual emissions are by sector. So in other words, like, how much does the steel industry get? How much does aviation get? Or how much do they need to decarbonize? And because we don't have that benchmark, I think we should certainly take a precautionary approach to it. Like, our climate models are terrible at representing trees dying. There are trees dying across the Arctic Circle and the boreal regions, and our climate models do not think trees should be dying there. And so we have these radical uncertainties about a carbon sink in even like a 2-degree world, let alone a 2.5 and a 3-degree world. So given these real feasibility issues with the level of CDR, that carbon dioxide removal, that can be delivered, and the lack of a reliable overall benchmark, this is why again, flying and farming, this kind of like precautionary approach, I think is sort of like the sensible way to go.
Yeah, I completely agree. We can't use offsetting as a free pass to continue life as we did, because that is not inherently sustainable. Number one, there's only ever going to be a certain number of offsets available. They're not an infinitely available thing, so you can't just keep going. And we are an over-consuming society, and we're going to have to reduce that because it's the only credible way to reduce atmospheric carbon.
Okay. Great. So we've got sort of 2 minutes left before we have the next poll. So perhaps then what I'll ask you is just to go around the table quickly. Do you think universities should be offsetting? So and is there anything you would say very strongly that we should limit ourselves to? So strong guidance on if you were going to say yes to that, is there something you would, a caveat you would make on that? Let me start with Joachim. Should we be offsetting, do you think, and what are the limits to it?
Yeah, I think we shouldn't be offsetting, but we should be very concerned about reducing. And as Rachel was saying, that in the longer term of reducing, even if it's much less than you can actually get with offsetting, given some 20, 30 years, you basically save much more. So that, I think, is where the money should go.
Okay. Okay. Very, very clear. That's useful. Carly, what do you think on this?
Yeah, so I mean, I assume that in transition period and also depending on what type of the activities are covered by offsets, I think universities can choose offsetting. So maybe in the form of, as Rachel discussed, some sort of the guidelines. However, the focus should be on quality projects. So if universities are choosing offset projects, then in my opinion, they should meet robust standards, because this is the reputation of the universities, and we sort of, I guess, influence society not only through the research and teaching, but also if we are sort of choosing to follow that route, then I guess we also need to set the high standards.
Excellent. Very good. Oliver, and then I'll finish with Rachel on that question. Oliver.
Yes, so I think King's should make offsets mandatory on all business travel, and those should be purchased through direct air capture, which is a technological solution to offsetting. You basically pump air through a sticky resin. It's a very reliable way of capturing a certain amount of carbon, and we want to scale this industry. We want as much of this as possible. I'm getting a pouty face from Rachel, but basically, I think that we should mandate this, and it's about $300 a ton at the moment, so that adds $300 to a return ticket to the USA. But apart from that, no, we should look to decarbonize.
Gosh, it's going to get very expensive then, isn't it? And a bit speculative with this DAC as well. But Oliver, I hear what you say. Radical proposal, really good, really good. Rachel, should universities be offsetting?
Yeah, just to respond to all quickly, it wasn't quite a pouty face, but the reason I pulled that face is because direct air capture is inherently inefficient because of the low concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere, and the very best direct air capture system we have are plants and trees who are optimum at doing it. And I think there's a consideration about whether it should be a mechanical direct air capture, because actually the challenge is getting the CO2 back out again, and the energy used in the pressure or the temperature swing that you're going to use to recover it, etc. We're not going to go into that now. Anyway, on your actual question, Franz, no with a caveat is the short answer. So I think we should be spending our money and our time and our effort on going as low as we can go and reducing. And my only caveat comes in on business travel, and that's not a free pass that any business travel can happen and can be offset. Because if, for example, you want to go to Germany, you should be taking the train, which will have a significantly lower carbon footprint than flying would be. So even with business travel, we should have, wherever possible, taken the lowest carbon option of that transport, which is likely to be a train or a tram, or depending on where you're trying to get to. It may not be possible. There will be some travel which is necessary, which incurs a much higher carbon footprint because you've, I don't know, gone somewhere further. Even then, we should be joining everything we can possibly do whilst we're there, not flying somewhere for like 2 days and flying back. If we're going to spend all that carbon going somewhere, we should do a little tour while we're there and do as much as we can. And I think, well, I hope that I haven't seen your travel principles, but this is the kind of thing that's in our Sheffield Sustainable Travel Principles, is about, if you're going to go somewhere, make the most of being there, and then and only then could you offset the carbon for that travel.
Yes, very good. We're taking a small first step, which is effectively to ban aviation within the UK, which is a sort of no-brainer, and very strongly encouraging everyone, if they can get there by land-based means within 5 hours from London, so broadly that's a Eurostar from St Pancras, then they should do that. But think very carefully if you if you really need to fly.
And the challenge and the thing for you to think about is actually, if I went from London to Germany, it would be cheaper for me to fly than it would be for me to get the train, right? And so the challenge you have when you encourage people to take the land-based travel is, where does the extra money it costs them to do that travel come from? And one of the things we're grappling with is, should there be some kind of central fund people can apply to enable them to take a lower carbon form of travel? And maybe in our grant applications, we should be putting in bigger travel budgets with the justification we want low carbon travel.
Exactly. Or we might do it through a levy. Yes. Okay. That's okay. All very good. And we're getting into practical matters, which we probably shouldn't in this case. So really excellent, fantastic discussion. I hope we have some Q&A to follow. But first of all, I think I'm going to hand back to Jona, if I have it right. Jona?
I think maybe we can do the questions first, just to see if that clarifies any more, then finish up with the polls at the end.
Okay, fine. Okay, so now it's up to our audience. I see there are 52 people still in the room, which is fantastic to see. Anyone have a question or a point to make in relation to the discussion you just heard? Be delighted to hear it. If you just stick your hand up in the usual way, then I'll find you. So the first person I've got is it Rose Lynn? Rose.
Hi there. I'm at the University of Aberdeen, and we're currently grappling with the situation of net zero before 2040 is our commitment, and we're looking at decarbonising scope 1 and 2. We've got a very large natural gas-fired CHP system, but we're also grappling how do we deal with scope 3. And part of our current conversations is we're quite fortunate to have large patches of land, and we're trying to push for the joint approach of reduce emissions as much as possible through behaviour and estate upgrades, but also look at the longevity of, could we improve our land to generate our own carbon offsets? Because in Scotland, we were initially given feedback, Scottish money for Scottish offsets, and then they realised there aren't enough Scottish offsets to offset, so then it was UK offsets, and there still isn't enough for all of Scotland, for example. So it's a very sort of difficult challenge. It'd be interesting to hear people's thoughts on where's the balance of funding? Should it be 50-50 split at this stage for us to 2040 between investing in our land and investing in our estate? Should we have been investing in land 10 years ago, for example? Where do the panelists feel the balance should be right now?
Okay, that's interesting. So I think what you're referring to here is what in the literature now has been called insetting. That is, you use your own assets to sequester carbon. And I suppose what you're talking about is Aberdeen has land holdings, and the plan might be to plant trees on that land, for instance, or to manage
some of the things we're looking at.
Wetlands or something in order to sequester carbon. Unfortunately for King's, as a city university, there's just not an option available to us, I think. Sadly, we have some roofs, but the amount of carbon we could capture there would be minute. So, but very interesting question there about the balance of effort. Do any in the panel want to talk about that? I mean, we've spoken, of course, already about the need to focus on reduction and then only use offsetting for residual emissions that are irreducible now or in the future, and those things might change, of course, as new technologies come online. What other guidance could people give to colleagues at Aberdeen, do you think?
I mean, you have to do your carbon accounting on it, right? So if you have a large CHP, that's going to have a huge emission currently. And if you started managing your land, you would nowhere near remove as much CO2 as your CHP is emitting in the near future. So you would be better at the minute, I would have thought, but do the calculations, spending your money to get rid of the CHP and install some heat pumps, or whatever might be the best solution for you there. But decarbonising heating is always the elephant in the room. So long as there's enough renewable electricity, you can move to renewable electricity, and decarbonising heating is tricky. So from my non-detailed calculation answer would be spend your money on the infrastructure to reduce your emissions in the first place, while coming up with a plan of how you might managing the land. But you still have the question of if you've got all that land, why doesn't it have trees on it already? And can you count it as an offset or not? And how does that be part of your portfolio?
Great, very clear. So, you know, as these things become more important, we have to be more and more careful about the cost of abating every marginal ton of carbon, and we're going to seek to do that as efficiently as we can. And that means we need to know a lot more about our emissions, and we need to know a lot about the options we have internally to reduce, and what each of those options costs. And that's partly the function of an internal carbon price. So I would say probably, Rose, that actually developing an internal carbon price and requiring, estates colleagues and colleagues buying gas to apply that to their resource allocation would be the sensible next step, actually. That's certainly something we're looking at here. Yeah. Right, any other questions? Anyone put their hand up? Gosh, everyone's been... Right. Tasnia. There's Tasnia. I haven't heard from Tasnia for ages. How are you, Tasnia?
I'm okay, Franz. How are you?
I'm very good. Nice to see you. What's your question?
So I'm not from a HE sector anymore, but one of the things that we're looking at, I work at a museum currently, is potentially insetting and using those funds for decarbonising, but it's kind of just conversations that we're having. And it is surrounding kind of heat pumps and like double glazing, and because we've got our estate is all graded and listed. So for us, it's been really difficult to try and decarbonise our buildings. But looking at a core function of ours is kind of exhibitions and business travel. And like it was mentioned, it's something that you can't really stop. You can kind of minimise as much as you can, but it's not something you can stop unless you want to stop making money. So what are kind of thoughts about using that that offsetting money as insetting for kind of decarbonising?
So this is a really interesting question about the recycling of income that you might make through levies or some other way. Any comments on this? Carly, I wonder whether we could appeal to the economist here. It's as in tax systems, you have this thing called hypothecation, which is you raise national insurance and you make sure that every last pound, for instance, it doesn't happen, but every last pound goes into the NHS. Usually people in finance ministries hate hypothecation because it's not necessarily efficient in the end to do it that way. But can you say something about the recycling of funds in this way, and is that something we should be thinking about? For instance, if we have a travel levy, £30 on every flight, do we immediately put that into a fund that, for instance, is paying for replacing boilers or something like that?
Yeah, no, this is a very interesting question, to be honest. I haven't thought of within this context. But as you said, yes, in economics, we have situations we thought about it. Actually, double dividend hypothesis, as you know, also is about that if we generate revenue from carbon taxation, can we reduce other taxes in the society, like taxes on capital or VAT taxes on labor and so on. So in general, I guess the conclusion of that literature was not very satisfactory because essentially the revenue generated from carbon taxation was not significant, while VAT is sort of the main sources of taxation. But within that context, I think it could be maybe more visible. But again, you need to assess what will be the return, in my opinion. Here, I'm just sort of thinking through this. So maybe just to evaluate, as always, what is going to be returned for every dollar spent in terms of options to recycle those revenues generated through taxation, let's say. Yeah. So as always, I guess this is also was mentioned in the previous point when Rachel was answering, I guess, the previous question is just you need to look at the low-hanging fruits. Maybe the reduction in emissions would be, yeah. So sort of consider different options, and probably you need to do that sort of cost-benefit analysis and to evaluate what will bring you the best sort of the outcome. That will be my answer probably.
Is that answering your question, Tasnia, or not? Does it help you?
I think so. I think we're trying to kind of do as much as we can with the decarbonising, but like I mentioned, it's a bit difficult when you've got a super old building. That doesn't really help you very much.
Yeah, so I assume, again, yeah, so before you do this, well, you need to get some information, some data. What is the carbon footprint of different activities? What is the cost of those activities? And what is the highest return on your money, I guess. So this is the way I would think.
Yeah, I would say that, yeah, the advice would be, you know, try and do significant things. So try and look to see where your big numbers are and try and tackle those. But then always try and low-hanging fruit. That was what Carly was saying. Always try and do the thing that is cheapest for you to achieve the reduction. So there are often some quite simple, low-cost things that you do first. But focus on the big numbers, you know, and the big numbers, as Rachel has said as well, is usually going to be the, you know, the heating of your buildings or the cooling of your buildings. That is often actually the really key thing to do. Joachim, and then I'll move on to Timothy Pullen.
Yeah, I wonder whether, I know this isn't offsetting or insetting or reducing anything, but I wonder whether it might be helpful to just have people who go to the museum give them information. You know, this is a beautiful old building.
Right.
It's been in there for so long. Look, this is how much goes out. I mean, just, you know, even if you can't do anything about that, but just explain that this is happening so that this is something that people bear in mind. Yes, having museums for us as a society, that is an emitter, basically.
It's part of your educational task, I suppose, as a musician.
I would
also
think so.
Now. Yes. Okay, very interesting point. Timothy Pullen.
Hi, sorry, I shouldn't unmute myself. Yeah, really interesting discussion, and I think we've touched on it, and I can see Oliver's mentioned in his comments, but I was really interested in the sort of the long-term stability of any of the offsetting we're doing, because if we're taking a flight and taking geologically stored carbon out of the ground, and then offsetting that as some trees, which will last for a while, and then we have a wildfire and all the carbon's released again, I worry slightly that any offsetting is not really addressing the problem. And as we mentioned with the sort of direct air capture, that actually doing proper carbon removal is very expensive. And if we do try and offset doing that, we actually probably find out that it's going to be cheaper to cut our emissions in the first place anyway. So don't we run the risk with any offsetting that we provide a low-cost fig leaf to carry on emitting without actually addressing the long-term problem?
Oliver, can you address this? I mean, you work on wildfire, so you know how often trees actually catch fire and where.
Yeah, I mean, the answer is yes. And I think it gets to this real tension almost at the heart of the way we think about decarbonisation. So we tend to think about decarbonisation as an economic problem, which it primarily is, and then we sort of think about these what we might call an earth system or a nature response to the climate afterwards. And so like our economic models do not consider fire risk to tree planting afforestation projects. And there's been a couple of papers recently that have mapped future projected fire weather, which is a sort of indicator of how hot and dry it is basically, with where our economic models are planting trees in order to meet the targets of the Paris Agreement. And they're a bit like that, right? And so yeah, so I mean, we need to fix that as an academic community. It's actually not good enough to be in that position in 2024, and it's as much about disciplinary silos as it is about just getting our act together and climate modelers and economists talking to each other more. but yeah, no. So I think that this is a real danger, and then it speaks to this issue that we ultimately don't know what the potential is for long-term carbon removals from the land, and so we need to be cautious about that, and to accept that this is a real uncertainty at the heart of all of these questions. So that's a very long way of saying yes.
Okay. Good. Carly, you have your finger up. And then maybe I'll come back to Rachel and Joachim.
Yeah, so
we're going to begin drawing to a close here.
sorry,
Well. Yeah.
I mean, sorry, very quickly. To be honest, I guess what you made reference to is a problem of the permanence of those trees, etc. I mean, obviously now there is also sort of trend where there is more use of new technologies. So drones, artificial intelligence, blockchain type of the technologies in order to address many of the issues that we have discussed in relation to offsetting in terms of improving monitoring, transparency, and some other issues. So I assume that should help to some extent. But as I mentioned earlier, I don't think that offsetting has been ever considered as sort of the permanent solution. It has been, at least as the economist interpreted it, was just to, I guess, because there is a time pressure, right? I mean, we have this pledges made by corporations by 2030, by 2050. So I think it is just a transition now. And in general, there are also estimates how much trees we need. And this is example I also provide in one of the lectures. A very simple example, you calculate the footprint of some biggest emitters in the world. You have estimates of the number of trees available on planet, and actually it's not sufficient. So, I mean, I don't think it has ever been considered as sort of the permanent solution.
Thank you. Okay, just one more question from Dawn Bonfield, and then I think we probably need to draw the discussion to a close, and there's one more poll, and I'll try and wrap up. Dawn, hello.
Yeah, hi there. Thank you very much for the discussion. It's really interesting. I've got a couple of sort of comments, I guess, really. I'm part of the Commonwealth Engineers Council, and one of our sister Commonwealth organisations, the Commonwealth Association of Land Surveyors, I think they're called, is talking about the problems in countries where the offsetting takes place, and they're seeing vast tracts of land being bought up for future offsetting purposes, so that people can use these in the future, and that is causing big problems for their own development. So, you know, as one of your speakers, I can't remember which one, mentioned earlier on, it's not just a question of carbon as we think of it over here. So we have to be really aware of where that offsetting is taking place. And also, we've got a conference next year, as you'll know, called Engineering Education for Sustainable Development, and we've got people coming to King's for that conference, and we're looking at the possibility of giving them offsetting options for their travel to King's, or for us to offset on their behalf. So if we do have a system in place, it would be also useful if we could use that to offset for visitors as well.
Yeah. Thank you, Dawn. I think this is, sorry, Rachel, yes, maybe you could comment on practice at Sheffield, yeah, on that sort of thing.
Yeah, well, we do what Dawn just suggested in terms of we would, you know, if we were inviting an external speaker for a reason, one, we'd invite them to a conference, two, we'd try and get them to meet as many people as humanly possible while they were here to maximise that trip, and three, we might offer to pay the offset. I was actually just going to pick up on the comment that's come in the chat, which relates to some of the previous questions, which was about, is it an and rather than an or? So we look at kind of reducing our emissions and about how we might grow removal. And I just wanted to say one thing on that, and it's not just about the date we get to net zero by, i.e. the date when our emissions are low enough and we're removing enough or whatever. It's also the shape of the curve getting there. So how much carbon do we emit on the way to the point we get to our net zero, whenever that might be? Because so we need to analyze all of our choices based on cumulative carbon emissions, not on what will our carbon emissions be in 2040 and have we hit net zero in 2040. And that's why in the very near future, big reduction projects are likely to have more of an impact on your cumulative emission than some of the removal projects. I'm not saying it should be either or, it should absolutely be both, but you have to look at the shape of the curve and the cumulative carbon emissions to make the decision about where to spend the money when.
Fabulous. Thank you very much. Doesn't make it any simpler, Rachel, to do all that modeling and calculation, but really, really important. And also, I think what a number of speakers have talked about is that, of course, to some extent, the future is uncertain. It's uncertain in terms of the kinds of technologies that might be available. It's uncertain about whether large-scale disposal options for carbon dioxide may actually become available, you know, in the next 10 years or so. So we're not just talking about planting trees or investing in energy efficiency projects and so on. It might actually be possible through, you know, carbon capture and storage to find a solution. Certainly engineers and geologists and so on have been working on this for decades already, and presumably at some point the price will make it possible to do that. Really interesting. Let's now go to the second poll. I hope, Yona, we're ready for that. Great. So broadly, Yona, what I'm understanding here is that we're simply being asked the same 4 questions and we're testing whether there's been a change in opinion. Is that right?
That's right. That's right. So after this very interesting discussion, let's see if we see any shifts or if people still have the same opinion.
A classic experimental design we've had here. You take the pulse, you do an intervention, and you see whether the pulse has changed. So let's see what's happened. Good, Yona. Does deliberation make a difference? A very interesting question in social science. Have the scores changed at all?
Yeah, it's actually quite interesting to see. Hopefully everyone can also see the results. But with the response that we have so far, more people seem to be supportive now of introducing a carbon offsetting scheme. So that has gone from 59% to 77% who say yes. How important people think it is has stayed the same at 3.6. And in terms of which emissions should be included in any potential offsetting, that has shifted quite a bit as well. So initially, there was more support for all unavoidable direct and indirect emissions, whereas now that has shifted more to business travel only. So I think I can understand how that is in light of the discussion. And in terms of the internal carbon pricing, which I think touches on also discussion around insetting, etc., that has increased as well. So from 76% to 82%. So very interesting to see those shifts in light of the discussion.
And we'll share those results with all the participants afterwards. We might write a very brief little note as well, just to share with people. So I'm not going to try and summarize everything because it's been such a wonderfully rich discussion. But what I take from this is that actually there is quite a lot of support for the idea of doing some offsetting. But we've heard today about the many dimensions of quality broadly of schemes, if you go, that one needs to be recognizing, to do with permanence and additionality and so on. There's also a sense that if we do it, we'll only do it for certain activities, and business travel seems a good one to start with. And I think quite a broad set of opinion and an agreement on the idea that the vast majority of our effort really needs to be in reducing emissions. 1, 2, and 3 eventually, once we can work out what they are and calculate them and get our suppliers to give us reliable data and so on. But also, I think what comes through is that there's still a lot of work to do in terms of understanding, in terms of the technicalities, in terms of verification, validation, monitoring, in terms of the new technological alternatives that may be there in the future to enable some of this sequestration to happen in a more permanent and reliable way as well. And I think in all those areas, universities can make a big difference. And then also, I think a point someone made right at the beginning is obviously society will be watching us, I suspect, and what we do may become quite influential. So not just what we say, but what we do. So we need to be cautious and responsible in how we do this policy, if it is indeed one that we do. So I want to thank all our panel members, Rachel Rothman particularly. Wonderful to have you. We might very well consult with you a little bit further as our own discussions develop, and maybe bring you in again. Oliver, thank you very much for your technical expertise. That was extremely helpful to this discussion. Carly, thank you very much for your perspective, which is fundamental. And of course, Joachim, I was really keen when we started the work on offsetting that we should have a philosopher involved, because I see all sorts of, as we discussed right at the beginning, all these moral, ethical issues are really central to it. And I'm so pleased that you're part of our discussion. So, and thank you to the audience, finally, the most important people, of course. Thank you for being here, and I hope you found it interesting. And thank you very much to Yona for making all this possible to prepare all of this, and I'm sure that we will all benefit and come to the next one. The next one, Yona, is on the 16th of May, I think. Is that right?
The 30th of May.
30th of May.
So
sorry,
also circulate that invite once it's out.
Yeah. And it's 3:30. Thank you so much for joining, everyone, and have a good rest of the day. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.